thank you for being here and enjoy Dave's presentation.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, I'm going to start by saying is that a lot of what I know about this topic, since I wasn't actually born then during World War II, comes from stories, and it has to do with both sides of my family. In particular, it's kind of pronounced from the standpoint that they're on opposite sides of the country. But usually, a lot of times they're just stories, and a lot of times some people are willing to talk about it and some are not willing to talk about it. But one of the things that I really appreciate is the fact that in each family, both my father's side and my mother's side, there was one person in each side that actually wrote things down, which is not the case in most cases. If I could do a plug for anything, I would say writing memoirs and things like that is a really useful exercise for everybody to manage of. So anyways, I'm going to talk about the Japanese American experience during World War II from two different families' perspectives. These are stories, and and I have some of these things over here. My mother wrote some memoirs that are over there. My uncle, my father really did not write things, but my uncle was a minister, and so he would write a lot of things, and he was very prolific about it. So that's how we know about that side. So, anyways. Okay. Well, let me just start by talking a little bit about how the two families came to the United States. Most of the Japanese that came to California came as laborers. It was mostly the turn of the century, not the 21st century, but the 20th century, around 1900. And they came with labor visas, and really there were only a few jobs that they could have. And a lot of times they were things like household work, laborers, working on the railroads, things like that. As they got more comfortable and congregated in areas, a lot of times there was rural areas that they started farming a lot, farming communities, and they became very successful a lot of times in the Central Valley. So the California legislature tried to slow this down. They did things like the 1913 Alien Land Act, which basically precluded immigrants from owning land unless you were a citizen. And then they also had laws that made sure that you could not become a naturalized citizen. So, so what often happened was what they would do is whatever assets they had, they would put in the name of the eldest son. So for instance, some of the things that my father's family assets were put in my father's name, and that's when he was like 14 years old or something like that. So this is quite
because he was a citizen, right?
Yeah, because if you were born here, you're automatically a citizen. So, okay, so my grandfather, Dr. Kamsaburo, he came from Kyushu, and he actually intended to stay in America, as opposed to a lot of people. A lot of the immigrants who would come, they were going to work and then go back to Japan, but he intended to stay, although before he was going to settle, he was going to head off to Germany for a period of time to get a little bit more medical training there. He was a doctor trained in Japan, which meant nothing in the United States. That he couldn't get licensed. He was going to do that, but he visited the Yamato farming community, which was kind of unique. It was a Japanese community, but it was a Japanese Christian community. And he was kind of unique actually because he converted to Christianity while he was still in Japan. There he met my grandmother, and stayed. Yeah. It's also very unique because on her side of the family too, they converted to Christianity in Japan as well. And so they had three sons, Harvey, who was my father, George, who became a minister, and Willie. A lot of things that I don't understand, but he was able to pull off some things that are kind of amazing. But at any rate, one of the ministers in the Yamato colony was very influential, very charismatic minister, and my uncle George was so impressed by him that he decided that he wanted to become a minister as well. So that's where they were. They lived on the family farm, which these are two pictures of it, which my father put in a trunk in the attic of our house, and so he made copies of it for each of the three of us boys, which to me was one of the nicest Christmas presents I ever got.
There's Central California?
Yeah, in Central Valley.
So these are farms in
This is
California. Oh, I thought it was, okay.
Anyways. Okay, so that's my father's family in California. My mother's family, Ryoji Ishiguro, he was the eldest son. His mother in Japan, his mother was widowed, and in Japan, it's the duty of the eldest son to provide for the education of all the other children. He was, even though they did own some land in Japan, they were not exactly wealthy, and really owning land was about the only way you could become wealthy in Japan. So he decided that he would go to America, make money, and send it back, which is something that in a lot of countries they thought that all the streets were paved with gold and whatnot. So he said, well, I can't lose on this one. So he arrived in Seattle, but again, he ran into the immigration issue of you can only get certain kinds of jobs in if you're an immigrant, and again, labor, household, railroad work. And he traveled around the country getting jobs. One time though, when he went to Salt Lake City in Utah, he was introduced to photography, which he enjoyed, and I guess he was pretty adept at it. So he decided that would be his profession going forward. He interned and made his way to the East Coast, New York, and in particular, there was this American car and foundry company that had a lot of employees and do a lot of portraits for them. And they also had offices in Long Island and in Milton, Pennsylvania. I'm not sure why Milton, Pennsylvania, but if you don't know, Milton, Pennsylvania is in about the middle of the state near Harrisburg. It's right across the river from Bucknell University. So, but at any rate, he through a series of events, he was able to buy out some of the retiring partners of this one studio. So he set up his practice in Milton, Pennsylvania. In 1920, he did return to Japan and married Tomiko. And it was an arranged marriage. She was went to school with one of his sisters, and so they were married. They came back. They were Buddhists, but they went to the Presbyterian Church in Milton. That was just something.
There's no Buddhist temple in Milton.
So anyways, they had two daughters, Mariko, who's my mother, and Emiko. And as they were growing up, they did not experience much harassment, name calling and things like that. they were able to assimilate pretty well into the community, and for her father, his business thrived pretty well. And they didn't prove to be much of an economic threat. Obviously, they were the only Japanese family in Milton, and the only Japanese anywhere were probably in maybe Philadelphia and some of the other larger cities. So that's how it started. Then came World War II, Pearl Harbor, and Executive Order 9066, which Franklin Roosevelt basically gave the Department of War, the War Department, the right to declare certain areas military zones, which for defense purposes allowed them to exclude certain groups that they felt threats to our country. Although we were at war, World War II was Japan, Germany, and Italy. It was the Japanese immigrants that, so they were excluded from these areas, which is essentially the whole West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California. And what initially happened was this was in, February 1941 or 42. Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. Right. And so February 1942, this went into effect. There was curfews. You couldn't travel beyond a 5-mile radius at any given time. Basically under martial law. All assets, like even for my mother's father, who had the photography studio, all his assets were frozen. I mean, he could continue to do business, but there had to be an agent, federal agent, that would accompany him to and from the bank to make sure he wasn't. The issue was they didn't want people withdrawing money and sending it back to Japan. So that's how that happened. Initially, they had a voluntary evacuation. They said, if we would like you to evacuate, so if you want to do it, please do it now. The issue was that the people in Japan, I mean, on the West Coast, they didn't know anybody else anywhere in the country, so very few had any place to go if they wanted to evacuate. Most didn't, but about 7% of the people did evacuate voluntarily. After that, starting in March, end of March, beginning of April, there was mandatory evacuation. That was when everybody had sometimes as little as 5 or 10 days to settle their affairs. They knew that there was this evacuation order that was coming, but they didn't know when or how serious or how long it would be. But then sometimes they were told, you have 1 week to settle your affairs. Well, try to sell one of those things, 5 days, and you can imagine what's going to happen.
Did that include Hawaii?
Okay, that's a good question. That did not include Hawaii. Hawaii, there were so many Japanese there that if they did that, it would destroy the economy. So there was no evacuation. There was no relocations or anything like that. They were under curfews and military rule and all that, but they would stay in their homes. They were allowed to continue to conduct business, whatever. Okay. As I said, once the exclusion orders came out, they had days to settle their affairs. My father had started a refrigeration business. He lost everything. Just, you couldn't sell it to anybody really, and so he had to. So he and his family, they had to. All you could take was what you could carry, and that was it. And they had to report to these assembly centers. My uncle George, who I said was inspired to become a minister, he was at seminary at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, and his future wife was also taking classes there. They were concerned that if they didn't get married, like right away, they could be separated because their families were from different parts of California. So they got married. Clearly, there was no family because nobody could travel more than 5 miles. But they got married very quickly, and then literally like 3 days before graduation, they were evacuated to San Fran, which is a racetrack fairground in the Bay Area. He was, well, this comment, I couldn't graduate or be ordained. In an interview sometime later, what he said was, most tragic and lonesome night in my life was the first night in San Fran Assembly Center. I walked back and forth in the evening under the searchlights of the soldiers in the guard towers, wondering why? The answer would come back, I was born a Japanese in the United States. We Japanese had no political power and thus were used as pawns by the politicians and by the many people who would gain materially through subjugation of the Japanese. So he was very depressed at that point. And then 2 things happened within a few days after this, his feelings. One was a person named Ward Stevenson. Ward Stevenson was a guard at the San Fran Assembly Center. He had been a classmate of George's at the Pacific School of Religion, but had to drop out and join the army and was there. He arranged, unbeknownst to George, to go pick up his diploma, and he brought it back to George in the camp. That would be something that I would think I'd be okay with. And a little while later, a few days later, there was a Reverend Robert Ingalls from the Plymouth Congregational Church of Oakland went around to a number of the other churches, Protestant churches in the area, and said, let's do the right thing. So a number of the clergy in the area, not all, but a number of them, came into the San Fran Assembly Center and held all the ordination ceremonies and things that had to be done in the mess hall of this another Bobby's got moment, I think.
Was your uncle ordained there?
So he was ordained there, yeah. It may not have been dotting all the I's and crossing the T's, but yeah. So at any rate. So it was, yeah. I'm just giving you an example of a picture of, this is Santa Anita racetrack. Those are the stalls, the horse stalls. And that's where a number of them were temporarily housed. They'd be temporarily housed there until they were sent to the various camps throughout the country. That just gives you an idea. You can see, those are the stalls. Those are the people, the guards. There are 10 relocation camps. I'm just showing you the ones that my father and his family was in Jerome, Arkansas. Arkansas actually had 2 camps there, Roar and Jerome. Initially, George was sent to a different camp with his wife, the one in Topaz in Utah. Although after a little while, he asked to be transferred to the Jerome site because to be with his elderly parents, and it was granted, so they did move down there. Jerome was it opened on October 6, 1942 and closed on June 30th, 1944. It was essentially 10,000 acres in the Mississippi floodplain. Originally, the governor of Arkansas said, "I don't want those camps here," and finally, until the federal government said, "Okay, we promise that we will have white guards guarding the camps, and after the war is over, none of the detainees will be allowed to stay in Arkansas." And then he agreed to do it. There were at this camp, there were between 8,000 and 8,500 detainees. This is the Jerome Center. It's not, again, it was in a floodplain. It was very, very cold. Remember, they only had what they could carry. So, like from California, you probably didn't have a lot of heavy, warm clothing or anything like that. There were disease outbreaks and things like that. In fact, George and Misaki's first child was born in this camp and died at birth. So, yeah, it was in it wasn't a floodplain. So, like I said, 8,000 to 8,500 detainees. There were 50 blocks. These are blocks, and 36 housed people, detainees. There were 250 to 300 living in each one of the blocks. Crowded in, because they wanted to move all these people out of California as quickly as possible. Actually, when the first detainees arrived here, the camp had not been completely finished. So those first detainees actually had to finish building the facility that they were going to be living in. And they didn't know how long. That ended up being probably a couple.
But were all of you coming from one of the Western Pacific Coast states?
Yeah, all of
That
them.
was the purpose.
I mean, some people will say it was they were war, but at the end of the day, there were no German evacuations from the East Coast, which like society and German could walk.
That'd be
almost anywhere.
3/4
You got it, brother.
I know some Italians were.
There were. I mean, there were a few, yes, but they were the ones that were.
Times are alright. Dennis.
I met a fella in Evanston.
How did they get food? There wasn't a lot of times. There was not a lot of food. I mean, all the food and things were brought in, but there rarely was enough. A lot of times there were a lot of gardens that the internees. I said inmates.
I didn't supply food.
No, they did supply food. It just wasn't all that much, and probably wasn't the cuisine they were used to. Right. Yeah.
Yes, but when you came to the coast states, did they take your material goods, your land, whatever you owned? What happened to?
Whatever you had to try and settle your affairs, meaning try to sell your.
Okay, so they didn't.
No, they didn't. But people would come in and offer, 5 cents on the dollar for whatever, and so our family was kind of fortunate from the standpoint that they did give this to some friends that and said if you could sell it, always do, but they were never able to get a very good price. And at the end of the war, they actually, the family actually got this land, this property back. But that was yeah.
Sorry.
We've seen displaced people in Europe walk to their new home or walk to get out. But do you have stories how they're transported?
It was by train.
Train?
And they were told that they had to keep their shades down as they went through. And this is surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, guns pointed in and out. Supposedly there are a lot of points it makes on the perimeter too. That's not really up to
Canada went into the war in 1939. Did they have a similar system or what? Because there were a lot of Japanese in Vancouver and
right, yeah. I can't speak to how it worked up there.
One thing, Alaska wasn't a state either, like Hawaii wasn't a state, and
No.
Alaska had a camp. You can find this online.
Really?
So I don't know.
I didn't.
It was a territory, so I don't know if that was federal government or not, but there was a camp in Alaska. Most people did not do that.
For everybody in the camp, they had to answer these questions. There were two at the very end, number 27 and 28, were called the allegiance loyalty question, which right now may not seem as terrible or anything like that. The first one was, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And the 28th is, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attacks by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Now, these are things that probably today most people would not take as quite as seriously, but just understand that these people just got evicted. They were taken across the country to places they didn't know for the amount of time that they had no idea. And so to say, well, you have to promise that you will defend this country that just took your land, basically took your life. Because remember, not only did they lose land, assets, and everything like that, but when you're in barracks, things like that, it completely destroys the family unit. Parents can't be parents anymore. Some of the kids probably had more fun because they didn't have to listen to their parents anymore. I mean, that's the way it was. They ate together. There was absolutely no privacy, and those kinds of things which completely break down a family. My father and my uncle George, who's the minister, they both volunteered. My father actually was not taken because he had some medical issues that he wasn't qualified. But my uncle did, and he served as the chaplain of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He has a lot of stories, and a lot of them are written. I'm not going to go into all of them because it's completely another hour or whatever we wanted. But ironically, all you have to do is Google George Aki, and you'll see a number of articles that were written about him. And there's even an archive thing. There, National Archives. There's a 1 hour interview with him about his experiences and whatnot. This is when he was I think he was in his late 80s at the time, but he lived to be 103.
Oh my God.
And actually, there is a relationship between him and this church actually, because he retired to Claremont Village, and I guess the Edgars also retired there, and so Nancy Edgar and he were at the same dinner table for a few years. I never knew any of that until I went out for his 100th birthday party. Out there. But at any rate, that was kind of interesting. The 442nd was all Japanese American except for the officers. They were all Caucasians. It was the most decorated unit, I think still is for the size that it is. There was 18,000 in that unit, and the number of Purple Hearts and whatnot, amazing. But at any rate, so his assignments were training assignments at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and then deployed later to Italy. And in Camp Shelby in particular, there was a lot of fighting between soldiers, mostly between the Japanese Americans from the mainland and the Japanese Americans from Hawaii. Now, the ones from Hawaii, they weren't interned and sent away and everything like that. So they were under rules and all that, but they had their freedoms, and so they were a little bit more cocky and whatnot. The mainland ones, not so much, and so there'd be big fights between them. But what they did was, a lot of times for R&R periods, they would have them go up to Jerome and Rohr, and Hawaiian Japanese Americans would see the conditions under which the mainland families were living in, had to deal with. It brought them together a lot more, a lot quicker. So again, if you want to know a little bit more about it, just Google them. And so the Ishiguro family in Milton, Pennsylvania, I have no pictures because there's no sense in taking a picture of somebody sneaking up on you or whatever, seeking ill of you. But they lived in a community of one. There was, like I said, no other Japanese families in Milton, and only a couple maybe in different parts, in different big cities on the East Coast. So I have to say, when World War II and Pearl Harbor broke out, my mother and her sister, they were both at Wellesley College, and so it was right before Christmas break. The deans of the college decided that it wasn't appropriate, it wouldn't be safe for them to go even from Boston down to Pennsylvania by train alone. So they decided to stay there. A lot of the families took them in and just made them part of the Christmas experiences that they would normally have with their families. Although there was one incident, Emiko was running for freshman treasurer or something like that, and there were articles about they wanted to deal with our money and all that. In Milton itself, like I said, they had made a lot of friends and were incorporated into the community. So there were a lot of people that were really supportive of them. Even when my mother graduated, they were able to. They were given some gas tickets and things like that, so they could have enough gas to drive up to her graduation ceremony and things like that. But that doesn't mean that you could just be comfortable walking down the street and not knowing what the next person might be saying or thinking. And there were these rumors going around, like my grandmother was related to the emperor. She had a Japanese flag on the roof so that the bombers wouldn't bomb their house. Why anybody would think that they'd want to bomb Pennsylvania. Even if they could, I mean, they could barely make it to Pearl Harbor. They're not going to make it. That grandfather was a spy, and that he was making these trips to New York with this big bag every Saturday night, and things like that. And the stress was such that even the parents had to tell my mother and her sister what their burial plans were in the event that something would happen. Seriously, they took it. Okay, so after graduation, remember, my mother graduated in 1942, so that it was during the war. There were very limited opportunities for her and all other Japanese Americans. She wanted to go into teaching or work in libraries and things like that, but she knew that she couldn't get any jobs there. She couldn't get any jobs in business other than secretarial, so she went to this Secretarial Institute and got a job afterwards at the Children's Aid Society, where she became interested in social work and decided that, well, maybe she could go back to school, get a degree. She was in Boston. Simmons College was there, and they did offer a graduate degree there, but they were not accepting any Japanese Americans. They said, well, no. There was a college in New York that she had heard that would accept Japanese Americans, and so she went up there to check that out. They said they said, yes, we would accept you, but she wanted to go to school in Boston, so she fought with the admissions people at Simmons, and finally they agreed to let her part of the program. But it wasn't just buy and check your grades and say, oh, okay. So she became a caseworker at Family Services in Staten Island and then in Philadelphia. And then when when they moved here, she was the social worker at the Glenview Public Schools for a number of years. In particular, during the time when the naval base was still open, and people were, well, mostly fathers were being shipped off to Vietnam. Her hands were full. Okay, so after the war, my uncle was discharged from the military, and he and my other uncle came to Chicago. My one uncle became a jeweler, and my uncle George became a minister. Well, was a minister and opened a church specifically for Japanese Americans in Chicago. My father, on the other hand, he went to Boston, and there he met my mother at one of these dances that some of these organizations were trying to the camps back into society. And so anyways, he went off to Hawaii for work, and she went out there, and they were married there. I was born there. And then eventually they came to Chicago to be with the rest of his family. So after the war, Jerome was just reduced to a marker, but to the people that lived through that, there were a lot of experiences, wounds that they had to deal with. When my parents first came to Chicago, they lived in the Kenwood area, south side of Chicago, but my mother was very insistent that education was important as a vehicle to move up in society and whatnot. So they were looking at homes in the northern suburbs. They found a home in Niles, close, I guess, to Gulf Mill, and they put in a bid. It was accepted until the sellers saw the name Hockey, and they said, "No, we're not selling to you." So the real estate agents, they said, "Well, there is another house. It's going to cost a little bit more. It's in Wilmette, but we're not going to broadcast it. It'll be like a private sale." And that happened. We moved into this house, and a million years later, Jim and Tom moved into a house that's like 2 blocks from where we are. I grew up in Wilmette. But anyways, we were one of 2 families, Japanese families in Wilmette. So yes, we experienced a lot of bias, but also a lot of very, very good friends, several of which I still keep up with even now. So next, in 1988, there was well, leading up to 1988, there was a commission to look into the internship program. Was it legal, et cetera? And the findings was that one, nobody was ever convicted of any crimes. There was never any incidences of espionage or sabotage. And in 1988, Reagan and the Congress passed legislation that allowed anybody that was actually in a camp to get a reparation, and they got a formal apology from what happened to them was wrong. So, and there's a project, it's called the Densho Project, and it's been going on for about 25 years, something like that. And it was started by a guy who worked at Microsoft for a while, retired, and he wanted to preserve the stories. And so he set up this organization that they would take any artifacts, pictures, articles, whatever, and digitize it, as well as conduct interviews on people that had been in the camps. And they were digitized so that they were there for posterity, and you also had access to it anytime you wanted to your things that you contributed. So you didn't have to worry about losing things and whatnot. I do have to say that nobody in our family ever participated in that, but it's a good thing. And I actually have a pamphlet over there. I think if you again just Google Densho, you can see. In fact, I think the founder just retired, and they have a new executive director. I met the original executive director when part of a touring exhibit of the camps that came to Chicago and whatnot. So like I said, yes, most of the stuff about the camps is gone. But in high school, if you take American history, there's an exercise or a project that most people do, and I think it happens in most of the high schools around in the suburbs here, where you are to interview your grandparents on some topic, and then you create a project out of it. And one of my nieces went to a high school in this area in the northern suburbs. She said, "Well, my grandparents have all died. They're no longer with us, but I do know this one story that I've heard about it. Is it okay if I use that for my project?" And the teacher said, "Well, yeah, if you know the details and your grandparents are dead, then yeah, go ahead. That makes sense. And the teacher said, well, what's the situation that you know, the story you know about? She said, well, it's about the internment of my grandparents during World War II. And the teacher said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. No, you can't do that because this can only be about incidences that really happened. So
Couldn't believe it.
You might have discussed it, but maybe I'll ask you again. How did you end up coming to Chicago? How did they end up coming here? Both sides of the family?
well, yeah, my
How was Chicago selected, I should say?
yeah, no, I'm not sure, but there were a lot of people that anybody that didn't go to California, a lot of them did come to Chicago. I've sort of mentioned there's this one uncle that is a little different and all that. Willie, yeah. Yeah.
Name.
He actually did not spend much or any time in the camps because he had this supposed skill of chick sexing where you could tell the sex of newborn chicks, and farmers, I guess, really valued that. So I'm segueing into your topic. Yeah, no, it is a real thing supposedly, and so there would be these armed guards that take him from chicken ranches from place to place, and whether. Well, he was one of the ones that went to Chicago, but it was mostly the community. There was a lot of Japanese that came to Chicago, and my uncle, is a minister. He wanted to do that.
Dave, you said that there were some other things about Willie that you didn't really understand.
No, he was. I mean that. Yeah. That's the only one.
It's fair.
Terry for Willie.
People overall were taking that interned in camps.
The numbers vary, but it's about 110,000. Yeah, there was.
Did your relatives lose all ties with people back in Japan, or do you know anybody there?
My uncle, the minister, when he retired, he did try to go back to Japan and look up some of the relatives. And, wars do that. They destroy all the records and things like that. So he really wasn't able to connect with any of them. And he's the only one that tried, but no.
It matters not, but was George ordained a under his?
Yeah.
But he's part of the church. So.
Yep. Yeah, it's a long.
What was his church in the Chicago area?
I don't remember exactly what it was called. It doesn't exist anywhere. It was over on. I think it was on.
Just for Japanese Americans?
Yeah, just because they would have services in English and in Japanese. Yeah. So yeah.
So it doesn't exist anymore.
No, and I mean that would be the place where for Japanese, the big deal is not New Year's Eve; it's New Year's Day, and we serve foods that we only eat on that one day. Mochi is one of them, and what you have to do is you're pounding certain kind of rice in I think it's a cherry stump that's hollowed out with mallets, and it's a really interesting thing. So a lot of times those things would happen at his church and whatnot. But and it's one of those things, though, like I said, it only happens once a year, and so person that's doing it passes, as happened with my grandmother, you're trying to remember, how does this look and all that stuff. So Melissa actually took pictures of all the different dishes and wrote out the recipes and created a booklet with it. And so first of all, you could look at the picture, you know what the end game was supposed to be for this one thing, and then you'd see the recipe and you were able to do that. So that's been invaluable. So
I was just gonna say, tell us a little bit about Mari, your mom, because she was just amazing.
She was a social worker in the Glenview schools, and again, I so much appreciate that in her later years she pulled together sometimes essays, sometimes some pictures and things like that, and so that we can read. There's things you just don't know, and for instance, we had two neighbors. The neighbors on one side, though, were very aloof. They weren't hostile or anything, but not much. And only after reading that collection of hers did we find out that family, the son, was actually in a Japanese POW camp. So now all of a sudden, oh wow, you understand that. But she was one of the founding members of the Community Renewal Society chorus, which went around all over the world to some of the Eastern European countries back when they were, part of the Russian Warsaw. And so she got to see a lot of those things at her memorial service. A number of those choir members came back and sang. Some were had to be almost carried up on stage, but they wanted to come back and do a final concert. And so it was a very meaningful experience for her.